It's strange, isn't it, how some names are remembered not just for how a life was lived, but for how it was taken away, and the legacy that followed. In the world of true crime, many cases remain shrouded in mystery, marked by unanswered questions and chilling silence. But sometimes, a case isn't just about crime, it's about resilience, forgiveness, and the haunting way tragedy lingers long after the violence has ended. The story of María Goretti is one such case on the surface. It seems straightforward. A young girl, just 11 years old, brutally attacked in her small Italian village in the year 1902. Yet the deeper you look, the more layers emerge. This wasn't only a case of violence, it became a story about faith, sacrifice, and a controversial kind of forgiveness that continues to spark debate to this day. How could someone so young endure such horror and still find the strength to forgive the one who destroyed her life? And more unsettling still, why has her death echoed for over a century, remembered not only by the church, but also by those who see in her story something far more complex than a simple act of martyrdom? As we retrace the final days of Maria's life, we'll step into the dusty lanes of a rural village where poverty, faith, and family hardship shaped her existence. We'll piece together the events leading up to that tragic summer afternoon, the harrowing attack, and the investigation that followed. And we'll ask the difficult questions that still hang in the air today. Was her forgiveness truly her own, or shaped by the voices around her? Did the justice system fail her, or was the punishment of her attacker enough? What makes this case even more haunting is not just the brutality of the crime itself, but the way it was remembered and retold. Maria's story became larger than life, her name sanctified, her image venerated, her death transformed into a symbol. But beneath the solemn portraits and whispered prayers lies the story of a real girl, one whose dreams, laughter, and childhood were cut short. This isn't just about a crime, it's about what happens when violence collides with belief. When a small act of forgiveness reshapes the legacy of a tragedy, and when a community's grief transforms into something that blurs the line between justice and sanctity. Over a century later, María Goretti's case still leaves us with unsettling questions. And as we unravel her story tonight, we invite you to reflect with us not only on what happened to her, but also on what it means when a life and a death become something more than just an unsolved mystery. Before María Goretti's name became forever tied to tragedy, she was, in many ways, just like any other child of her time, innocent, lively, and full of quiet resilience. To understand the weight of what happened to her, we first need to step into her world, to see her not as a figure frozen in sainthood, but as a living, breathing girl whose life was both ordinary and extraordinary in ways we often overlook. Maria was born on October 16, 1890, in a humble farming family in the Italian countryside. Her parents, Luigi and Assunta Goretti, were hard-working peasants who made their living tilling the land near Coronaldo, a small rural town. Life was not easy. Poverty shaped everything. Food was scarce, luxuries non-existent, and every pair of hands, no matter how small, contributed to survival. Yet despite the hardships, the Goretti family was known for their closeness, their warmth, and their deep-rooted faith. From an early age, Maria stood out for her gentle nature. Neighbors often recalled how she carried herself with a maturity that seemed unusual for someone so young. She had a soft voice, quick smile, and a patience that belied her years. For her younger siblings, she was more than just a sister. She was often a caretaker, a second mother, especially after tragedy struck the family. In 1900, when Maria was only 9 years old, her father Luigi fell gravely ill with malaria, a disease that plagued many poor farming families at the time. Within a short span, he died, leaving Assunta a widow with 6 children to feed and raise. Suddenly, the weight of responsibility shifted, and Maria, as the eldest daughter still at home, had to step into a role no child should bear. She became her mother's right hand, managing household chores, cooking meals, and watching over her younger siblings while Assunta worked in the fields. It's easy to imagine how a child might have crumbled under such pressure, but Maria adapted. Accounts from those who knew her describe her as steadfast, rarely complaining, and always putting her family first. While other children in the village played in the fields or chased after one another in the dusty streets, Maria was often at home, rocking a baby to sleep or kneading bread with flour-coated hands. Yet, within that sacrifice, there was no bitterness. She seemed to embrace her role with quiet strength, her sense of duty flowing from both love for her family and the strong Catholic faith that anchored her life. Religion played an enormous role in shaping Maria's character. From the time she could walk, she was drawn to prayer. She found comfort in the rhythms of the rosary, in the flickering candles of the small parish church, in the rituals that gave structure to her difficult life. Neighbors recalled her devotion, noting how she would attend Mass whenever she could, sometimes walking long distances barefoot just to be present. She dreamed of making her first communion, an event she anticipated with childlike eagerness, though poverty meant she didn't even own a proper dress for the occasion. Despite the weight of responsibility and the challenges of her environment, Maria still carried within her the essence of childhood. She loved simple things, singing quietly while working, listening to her mother's stories, and watching the sunlight dance on the wheat fields near her home. In many ways, she embodied the innocence of a child untouched by the wider worlds. Corruption, even as she faced struggles that most of us today can hardly imagine. But Maria's life was not isolated. After her father's death, Assunta moved the family to the small town of Ferrieri di Conca, near Nettuno, to live and work alongside another family, the Serenellis. They were to share a farmhouse, dividing the labor of the land and the space of the home. It was a practical arrangement, born of necessity, but it would prove to have fateful consequences. The Serenelli family, particularly Alessandro Serenelli, would become central to Maria's story. At the time, Alessandro was a young man in his late teens, troubled, restless, and by many accounts, deeply conflicted. He came from a harsh background, raised in a fractured home where violence, instability, and neglect shaped his view of the world. Living in such close quarters meant Maria and Alessandro's paths crossed daily. To her, he was simply part of the environment, someone older, unpredictable, but not someone she feared openly. Yet, beneath the surface, a darker dynamic was beginning to unfold, though no one could have foreseen its devastating conclusion. Still, in those years before the attack, Maria's identity was defined not by fear, but by devotion to her family, to her faith, and to the fragile hope of a better future. She carried dreams, though they were modest ones. Some said she hoped one day to marry, perhaps to live a quiet life like her mother, raising children of her own. Others believed she was so drawn to her faith that she might have pursued a religious life had circumstances allowed. We will never know for certain. What we do know is that Maria was a girl whose kindness left impressions on everyone she met. She was remembered for offering food to neighbors, even when her own family had little, for showing compassion to children smaller than herself, and for her unwavering patience in the face of hardship. She may not have had much in terms of material wealth, but she had a richness of spirit that stood out in a community accustomed to suffering. Looking back now, more than a century later, it's easy to see why Maria's life and her death resonated so deeply. She was not extraordinary because of privilege or power, but because of her simplicity, her strength, and her refusal to let hardship erode her compassion. In her, people saw not just a victim, but a reflection of the values they cherished and longed for in themselves. And yet, as we move closer to the events that would change everything, It's difficult not to feel a profound sadness. For all her resilience, Maria was still a child, a girl who deserved laughter, play, and freedom from the burdens of adult life. Instead, she carried a weight far beyond her years. And when tragedy came, it came to someone who had already sacrificed so much, who had already proven her quiet strength in the face of poverty and loss. It is here, in the contrast between her ordinary innocence and the extraordinary violence she endured, that the true weight of her story lies. To understand Maria Goretti, we must see her not only as a saint or a symbol, but as a young girl whose life, though short, was lived with a purity of heart that continues to haunt us to this day. On the morning of Saturday, July 5, 1902, nothing seemed unusual in the small farming village of Le Ferrieri, Italy. The Goretti family, like most others in the area, woke to the rhythm of agricultural life, early hours, long fields, and work that rarely waited. 12-year-old Maria Goretti rose early, tending to her younger siblings as her widowed mother, Assunta, joined the neighbors in the wheat fields. It was hot that summer, the kind of day where the sun seemed to press down heavy on both land and spirit. By all accounts, Maria began her morning the same way she always did, dutiful, quiet, and with a maturity beyond her years. But sometimes, the days that feel most ordinary are the ones that change everything by late morning. The fields surrounding the Goretti home were buzzing with activity, but inside the farmhouse, things were still. Maria remained home to watch her siblings, preparing lunch as she often did. It was then that Alessandro Serenelli, a 20-year-old laborer who lived in the same house with his father, made his way inside. At first glance, there was nothing alarming about this. Alessandro had been around the Goretti family for years, sharing the same living quarters, the same fields. Yet, beneath that surface of familiarity lay something more troubling. Accounts later revealed that Alessandro had already made several unwelcome advances toward Maria in the months leading up to this day. Each time she resisted firmly, reminding him that what he wanted was wrong. "No, Alessandro. It is a sin," she told him more than once, words that seemed to echo louder with each refusal. That morning, when he entered the farmhouse, Alessandro carried something with him, not farm tools, not a bag of food, but a small iron file sharpened to a point. It was an object out of place, and yet in the moment, no one else was there to question it. Inside the dim farmhouse, Alessandro cornered Maria. The children, too young to understand, played nearby, but the tension between the two was palpable. He demanded once again what she had denied him before, pressing his threats more directly this time. For Alessandro, this was not simply lust. It was a disturbing fixation, one that had consumed his thoughts and warped his sense of reality. Maria resisted him once more, holding to the same conviction that had guided her all along. "No, Alessandro. God does not want it. You will go to hell." Her words were not screamed in panic, but spoken with the clarity of someone who believed deeply in what she said. For Alessandro, that refusal, that unwavering faith, cut deeper than any insult, and then he snapped. In a fit of rage, Alessandro pulled out the weapon he had concealed and drove it into Maria. Once, twice, again and again. By the end, she would be stabbed 14 times, her small frame collapsing under the weight of his fury. The children's cries rang out, their screams piercing the walls and carrying out into the sunlit fields. Neighbors dropped their tools, confused at first, then horrified as they heard the chaos. Assunta, working nearby, rushed back toward the house. The distance was short, but to a mother hearing those screams, every second felt like an eternity. When Assunta arrived, what she found was beyond comprehension. Her daughter lay bleeding, gasping, but still conscious. Alessandro, shaken and panicked, attempted to escape, But the commotion drew villagers quickly. He was apprehended not far from the farmhouse, overpowered by neighbors who restrained him until the authorities could arrive. Back inside, Maria was slipping in and out of consciousness. The wounds were severe, and blood loss was rapid. Yet, even in that agony, she found words. She identified Alessandro as her attacker, and more remarkably, told those around her that she forgave him. Doctors were called, but in a rural village in 1902, medical aid was scarce. Maria was placed on a cart and carried to the hospital in Nettuno, miles away. The journey was brutal. Every movement pressed against her wounds. Witnesses said she prayed softly, her voice faint but steady. By the time she reached the hospital, infection had already set in. Surgeons did what they could, but the damage was catastrophic. They performed procedures without anesthesia. There was simply no choice, but Maria endured, whispering prayers even through the unimaginable pain. As evening fell, Maria's condition worsened. She was slipping away, but her mind remained astonishingly clear. When a priest asked if she forgave her attacker, she answered without hesitation, "Yes, for the love of Jesus I forgive him, and I want him to be in heaven with me." Those words struck everyone present. They were not the words of a child consumed by anger or despair, but of someone who, even in her final hours, clung to her faith. At 3:45 p.m. the following day, Maria Goretti succumbed to her injuries. She was only 12 years old. In the span of less than 24 hours, a normal summer day had been transformed into one of the most shocking tragedies the village, and later the world, would ever know. The questions began immediately. Why had Alessandro's obsession been allowed to fester unchecked? Why had no one noticed the warning signs of his fixation? Could this attack have been prevented if someone had acted sooner? These questions lingered in the air, unanswered, as Maria was laid to rest. And yet, in the shadow of violence, another narrative began to take shape, the story of a child whose final act was not bitterness, but forgiveness. It was this contrast, the brutality of the crime set against the serenity of her words, that would echo long after her death, carrying her story far beyond the wheat fields of Le Ferrieri. What began on that ordinary Saturday morning as a day of chores and work ended in tragedy. But the echoes of that day, the screams, the shock, the forgiveness continued to haunt and inspire more than a century later. When the first reports of the attack reached local authorities, the response was swift, though not without its limitations. This was rural Italy in 1902, a place where news traveled by word of mouth, and police work was shaped less by science and more by testimony, intuition, and community judgment. Still, the brutal assault of a 12-year-old child was shocking enough to command immediate attention. Officers arrived at the Goretti farmhouse within hours of the incident, finding a scene that was as chaotic as it was heartbreaking. Neighbors clustered outside in silence, mothers clutching their children tighter, while inside, the bloodstains on the wooden floor bore witness to the violence that had unfolded there only moments earlier. The prime suspect was never in question. Alessandro Serenelli had been caught within the hour, apprehended by villagers who restrained him until law enforcement could arrive. His arrest was direct, without resistance. The evidence against him, Maria's own words, the weapon, and the testimony of witnesses who had seen him enter the farmhouse, was overwhelming. In many ways, the case seemed clear-cut from the very beginning. Yet, the investigation would stretch far beyond the act itself, delving into the psychology of the attacker, the faith of the victim, and the ripple effect on the community that had witnessed both tragedy and forgiveness in a single day. Interviews were conducted quickly. Maria, though gravely injured, provided her account from her hospital bed. Her statement was short, but definitive. She named Alessandro as her attacker and described how he had threatened her before. Other children in the house, gave fragmented testimonies, their memories clouded by fear, their words broken by sobs. Neighbors recalled hearing the screams and rushing to the scene, painting a vivid picture of the chaos that erupted in those few minutes. Assunta, still in shock, described her daughter's final hours, her calm insistence on forgiveness, even as her life slipped away. From the outset, investigators had little doubt of Alessandro's guilt. Still, protocol demanded a careful examination of evidence. The weapon, a sharpened iron file, was recovered near the farmhouse, stained with Maria's blood. Medical reports documented the 14 stab wounds, noting their depth and placement. In today's context, forensic science might have provided more layers of detail: DNA analysis, blood spatter reconstruction, psychological profiling. But in 1902, these tools did not exist. The investigation relied instead on human observation, on the words of those present, and on the moral clarity of the victim herself. There were no alternate suspects. Unlike modern cases, where investigators often consider a range of possibilities before narrowing their focus, this crime offered little room for doubt. Alessandro's presence at the scene, his weapon, and his past behavior toward Maria created a picture so stark that even without the forensic methods we depend on today, the narrative was difficult to dispute. And yet, within the certainty of his guilt, questions lingered, questions not of who had committed the crime, but of why it had happened and whether it could have been prevented during interviews. Alessandro's father, Giovanni, spoke of his son's troubled nature. He described him as restless, easily angered, prone to unhealthy fixations. Others in the village recalled moments when Alessandro's behavior had seemed odd, his gaze lingering on Maria in ways that unsettled those who noticed. These recollections, when pieced together, painted a troubling portrait of a young man spiraling into obsession, his desires unchecked until they erupted in violence. And yet there was also sympathy, however quiet, for the life circumstances that had shaped him. Alessandro's upbringing had been marked by instability, poverty, and hardship, factors that, while never excusing his actions, offered some context for the anger that seemed to consume him. The trial that followed was covered extensively by local newspapers, though the tone was different from the sensationalist reporting we often see today. Italian papers of the time framed the story not only as a crime, but also as a moral tragedy, clash between innocence and corruption, faith and sin. Articles described Maria as a martyr-like figure, emphasizing her final words of forgiveness. Alessandro, on the other hand, was cast as a cautionary tale of what unchecked desires and spiritual weakness could become. The coverage reflected not just the facts of the case, but also the values of a deeply Catholic society, where the meaning of Maria's sacrifice was already being considered alongside the details of her death. In court, Alessandro initially showed little remorse. He confessed to the attack, but offered little explanation beyond a bitter acknowledgement of rejection. His demeanor was cold, detached, as though he struggled to grasp the gravity of what he had done. Witnesses testified to Maria's character, her steadfast refusal to compromise her beliefs, her extraordinary forgiveness. These testimonies created a narrative that was as much about morality as it was about justice. One of the limitations investigators faced was the lack of deeper psychological understanding. In a modern context, Alessandro might have been evaluated for mental illness, his fixation examined through the lens of psychiatry. In 1902, however, such insights were largely absent. He was seen simply as a criminal, a man who had acted violently out of lust and rage. While this was true, the absence of psychological evaluation left certain aspects of the case unexplored. Why had his obsession escalated so drastically? Could intervention at an earlier stage have altered the outcome? These were questions that went largely unasked at the time. As the trial progressed, the evidence left little room for doubt. The jury found Alessandro guilty, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For some, this punishment seemed too lenient. For others, it was an opportunity for redemption, a belief that even someone capable of such violence might still find forgiveness. It was here that Maria's final words took on even greater weight. Her insistence that she forgave Alessandro and that she wished to see him in heaven became a central point of reflection, both inside and outside the courtroom. Public perception of the case was deeply divided. On one hand, there was outrage, a demand for harsher punishment, a cry for justice in the face of unspeakable cruelty. On the other hand, there was a growing narrative of Maria as a symbol of purity and faith, her death transforming into a story not only of loss, but of spiritual victory. Newspapers reported on pilgrimages to her gravesite, on families who told their children her story as an example of steadfast morality. In this way, the investigation and trial became more than legal proceedings. They became the foundation of a legacy that extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Despite the clarity of Alessandro's guilt, the investigation was not without its peculiarities. Some villagers whispered of signs they had overlooked, moments when Alessandro's behavior had seemed suspicious, opportunities for intervention that were missed. Others questioned whether more could have been done to protect Maria, especially as her rejections of Alessandro had been known to those around her. The investigation did not explore these threads deeply, perhaps because the legal system of the time was more concerned with assigning punishment than with examining broader societal responsibility. As time passed, Alessandro's own story shifted. In prison, he experienced what he later described as a profound spiritual awakening, claiming that Maria had appeared to him in a dream, offering him forgiveness once more. Whether one interprets this as a genuine vision or the psychological effect of guilt and solitude, it altered the way the case was remembered. Alessandro would later seek forgiveness publicly, spending his final years in a monastery as a lay brother. This transformation, if sincere, added another layer of complexity to an already extraordinary story. In the end, the investigation into Maria Goretti's death achieved its most immediate goal. It identified the perpetrator, established his guilt, and brought him to justice. Yet, unlike many true crime cases, this investigation left behind more than just legal resolution. It ignited debates about morality, forgiveness, and the nature of evil. It drew attention not only to the limitations of early 20th century law enforcement, but also to the enduring power of one child's final act of grace, even now. More than a century later, the details of the investigation continue to provoke reflection. How does a community process such a crime? What does it mean to forgive the unforgivable? And how do we remember the victim not merely as a case file, but as a person whose life, though tragically short, carried a message that still resonates across time? Many believe the simplest reading is the truest one. Alessandro Serenelli, a young man steeped in resentment and obsessive desire, saw an opportunity when Maria was alone, tried to force himself on her, and when confronted with a fierce refusal lashed out in rage. In this view, the motive is painfully clear. Sexual coercion turned to violence when power and control slipped from his grasp. The means are equally straightforward. A sharpened file, a common tool on a rural property that became a weapon in his hand. And the opportunity presented itself on an ordinary summer afternoon, scorching heat. Neighbors at a distance, chores to do, a child inside a farmhouse that had never felt dangerous until the moment it was. We recognize the pattern because we've seen it in too many cases. Fixation, boundary testing, escalation, and then a breaking point that cannot be reversed. Under that frame, the evidence falls into place with disquieting ease. Alessandro had pursued Maria with crude propositions and cornered conversations. Witnesses remembered uneasy glances, lingering proximity, the way his voice hardened when she rebuffed him. Maria named him as her attacker from her hospital bed, a clarity of identification that law enforcement in 1902 would have treated as decisive even without modern forensics. The weapon lay where he dropped it. Neighbors had seen him approach the house, and there was no viable alternative suspect, no wider conspiracy waiting in the wings to complicate what stood in front of everyone's eyes. If you follow this line, the moral logic is intact as well. Lust curdled into violence. Violence demanded justice. Justice, however imperfect, was delivered. We also understand how the social context reinforces this obvious story. Rural life meant privacy and isolation existed side by side. Families worked long hours. Children learned to keep the home running, and community norms could be as protective as they were permissive. A boy like Alessandro could go unnoticed until he was impossible to ignore. A girl like Maria could be praised for virtue, yet left to fend off a determined predator in a house with thin walls and no alarm but her own voice. It's uncomfortable, but it fits, means motive. Opportunity aligning so tightly that the story seems to write itself. And yet, if we sit with it, if we let the day breathe and the details cool, there's something that doesn't quite add up. Not about who did it, but about how the spark caught and why it became an inferno. Was this purely spontaneous rage, or did Alessandro step into that room, having already crossed the internal line from fantasy to intention? Many believe he acted in the heat of the moment. Others point out that he had threatened Maria previously, that he had singled her out, that the weapon was not invented out of thin air. If the file was simply at hand, the act reads as impulsive. If he brought it with purpose, we edge closer to premeditation, the difference between a dreadful opportunity and a dreadful plan. There's also the question of why the community, and even Maria's family, seemed to understand his fixation, yet lacked a vocabulary for intervention. We can say it was a different time, and we'd be right. But the obvious theory assumes inevitability, as if the path from obsession to attack was a straight road rather than a narrowing corridor with untested doors along the way. Did anyone confront him? Did anyone warn him off formally? Did anyone think to alter the rhythms of the day, the chores, the watchfulness, the bustling comings and goings, so that Maria would never be alone near him? The obvious answer leaves these as footnotes. Reality suggests they deserve more weight. Even Alessandro's demeanor complicates the clean lines of motive. Accounts describe him, in the early stages, as sullen and defiant, consistent with someone who believed he'd been provoked by refusal. But later, after months and years, he spoke of remorse and claimed a profound inner awakening. Many believe this says nothing about the crime itself, only about what followed. Still, it invites a question we don't like to ask. Was the why as simple as we tell ourselves, or did a web of shame, immaturity, and learned entitlement prime the explosion? In other words, does the obvious answer explain the act, or only describe it? Then there's the uneasy dual narrative of virtue and violence. Maria's refusal, rooted in faith, dignity, and a child's clear boundary, has often been portrayed as the axis upon which the event turned. That version is true and necessary. It keeps her a person rather than a symbol. But it can flatten the psychology of the attacker into a single crude dimension. Want, deny, kill. Many believe that's enough. Perhaps it is. But when we look across cases with similar contours, we see a pattern that thrives in silence and thrives in hindsight. What feels obvious later was frequently contested, minimized, or moralized in the moment. The absence of deeper protective structure, social, familial, legal, becomes part of the means. An invisible weapon placed in the attacker's hand. Still, the core of Theory 1 remains. A young man committed a violent assault when denied the control he demanded. The evidence is cohesive. The legal outcome aligned with it. The victim's identification sealed it. The doubts that surface don't exonerate, they contextualize. They remind us that the obvious answer, while accurate in its essentials, may be incomplete in its architecture. It identifies the attacker, but it risks leaving the supporting beans culture, power, proximity, and the everyday logistics of safety out of frame. So where does that leave us? With a theory that holds, and with a responsibility to look past it. We can say, truthfully, that Alessandro acted out of sexual aggression and rage, and that Maria's courage cost her life. We can also say, just as truthfully, that the systems around them, fragile, informal, and unprepared, shaped the opportunity. Many believe the story ends with a conviction and a conversion. We're not so sure. The obvious answer solves the case. It doesn't solve the conditions. And if something doesn't quite add up, it's because an open and shut narrative can be both correct and insufficient right about the who and the what, and quieter about the why that keeps echoing. When a case seems so clear, when the lines of guilt appear sharp and undeniable, there's often a temptation to stop looking any deeper. Many believe that Alessandro Serenelli's attack on Maria Goretti was both the beginning and the end of the story. And yet, it's hard not to wonder whether the details we accept as obvious may conceal quieter, unsettling truths. Could it be possible that what unfolded that summer day was not only about one man's rage, but also about forces social, familial, and even spiritual that remain more elusive? One of the more unsettling theories arises from the question of opportunity. How was Alessandro able to corner Maria so easily in a home that was rarely without movement or interruption? It's true that rural life often left children managing chores while adults worked the fields. But in this case, Alessandro seemed to know the exact moment Maria would be alone. Was this a matter of chance, or had he observed her routines closely enough to calculate his move? Some speculate that his access and timing suggest premeditation far beyond impulse, that he may have been watching her for days, possibly even rehearsing the scene in his mind. That idea is deeply unsettling, because it paints a picture of a young man not simply reacting in the heat of passion, but carrying a plan, however crude, until the right moment came. Another theory questions whether the violence itself had layers beyond sexual frustration. Alessandro's home life was harsh, his relationship with his father strained, and his exposure to cruelty was not uncommon. Could it be that his attack on Maria was also an eruption of rage accumulated from years of abuse, poverty, and humiliation? If so, then Maria was tragically not just a victim of his obsession, but also the target onto whom he displaced his own suffering. This doesn't excuse what happened, of course, but it reframes the act not merely as a crime of lust, but as a crime born from a darker cauldron of anger and despair. There's also the unsettling question of silence within the community. Neighbors had reportedly been aware of Alessandro's fixation. Some even recalled uneasy encounters where he cornered Maria or spoke of her in ways that were clearly inappropriate. And yet, no one intervened decisively. Could it be possible that unspoken cultural norms, where young girls were expected to endure, or male behavior was excused as immaturity, allowed the danger to grow unchecked? In this sense, the crime becomes not only Alessandro's, but also the community's failure, a shared silence that left a child vulnerable. That is a chilling thought, that what feels like an individual act of violence was, in part, enabled by collective inaction. Then there's Maria herself, whose refusal has often been described in moral and religious terms. She is remembered as saying, "No, Alessandro, it is a sin. God does not want it." But here's an unsettling angle. What if Maria sensed, earlier than anyone else, just how dangerous Alessandro truly was? If she had rebuffed him firmly before, perhaps she recognized that his fixation had tipped into menace. Did she try to warn anyone? Did she feel a growing fear that went unnoticed? If so, her final words were not only an act of faith, but also the culmination of weeks, perhaps months, of living in the shadow of a threat that no one else seemed willing to confront. That possibility shifts the tragedy yet again, from sudden violence to a long, slow dread ending in bloodshed. Some have even speculated about spiritual dimensions, though not in the miraculous sense. Could Alessandro's behavior have been influenced by untreated mental illness or by the corrosive effects of isolation and deprivation? Was his fixation not just lust, but obsession tipping into delusion? In modern terms, we might consider stalking behavior or obsessive-compulsive patterns. But in 1902, such language didn't exist. Instead, people called it temptation, sin, or simply bad character. That leaves us with a troubling thought. Perhaps what seemed like a single, monstrous act was actually the endpoint of a psychological decline no one could name at the time. Finally, there is the deeply unsettling silence in Alessandro's later confessions. Yes, he admitted to the attack, and yes, he expressed remorse after years in prison. But he never fully explained why. He admitted to desiring her, admitted to rage when she resisted, but he never articulated the deeper motive that could explain such brutality. Did he not know himself? Or did he hold something back, something even he could not bear to name? That gap, the why, that remains unsaid, is what keeps this case from ever sitting neatly in our minds. So, where does this leave us? The official story resolves around lust and rage, but the unsettling theories whisper of something more. Premeditation disguised as impulse, community silence that gave danger room to grow, a child sensing her fate before anyone else would listen, and a perpetrator whose true motives may have been more complex than he ever revealed. It's not about overturning the obvious answer. It's about accepting that sometimes the most disturbing truths lie not in what we know, but in the shadows of what we will never fully understand. For Maria's family, of course, the trail went cold in a different, more painful way. They had to live with the weight of what happened, without ever receiving the kind of closure that comes from fully understanding why their daughter was taken. Time moved on, but grief never left. As we reach the end of Maria Goretti's story, it's clear that this case is more than a tragedy. It's a paradox. On one hand, the facts are simple. A young girl, brutally attacked, died of her wounds. Her killer confessed, served his sentence, and later sought redemption. On the other, the story refuses to rest. There are unanswered questions, conflicting accounts, and silences that still echo across time. For many, Maria is remembered as a saint, her forgiveness in her final hours becoming a symbol of hope and resilience. And yet, sainthood doesn't erase the harsh truth of what happened. A life stolen, a family broken, and a crime that may never be fully understood. What lingers most is not only the horror of the act, but the extraordinary choice Maria made at the very end to forgive. That choice rippled outward, changing her attacker, shaping the faith of millions, and ensuring her name would never be forgotten. But even now, more than a century later, we are left with questions that cannot be answered. And perhaps that is why her case, like so many in true crime, still haunts us.